Hi everyone, I'm Anya. Welcome back to my channel. So some of you may know I graduated from college recently, and one of the first responsible adult decisions I made was to marathon all 9 of the Star Wars movies plus Rogue One. I think Star Wars, for me and for a lot of people, has been such a foundational part of my childhood and my development as a creator and a storyteller that it really got me thinking about the influences and the things that I might have learned about writing that I've gotten from Star Wars. And of course, it's had such a strong hold over the popular imagination. So I really wanted to think more deeply about what makes it work as a story, how I can apply that to writing, and sort of what influences it might have had over me. This is going to be a 3-part series. The first part will cover the original trilogy, and of course I will post the links to the other 2 parts in the description when I make them. And I do want to note that I'm covering the movies in the order of making because that is the order that audiences were introduced to the world, and I think that that's the most important thing when you're thinking about the relationship between either a book and a reader, a movie and an audience, but I will be addressing some elements regarding the in-universe timeline. So I don't think I have any more notes, so let's get started. So episode 4, A New Hope. This is the first introduction that we get to this really huge, sprawling, fictional world. And so the first question on my mind was, how does that work? And there are 4 things that I noticed. The first was that they summarized the backstory, the necessary information really quickly. In a universe that is as sprawling as Star Wars is, you really don't have time to show everything. Sometimes you just have to tell and get all the foundational facts out there really fast. And in Star Wars, it's really obvious how they do that, which is that opening crawl. It's 3 tiny paragraphs that sets up basically everything you need to know about the world. And let's go through them paragraph by paragraph. So first paragraph, you see, okay, it's a civil war. You see what the 2 sides are, you see what their relative strengths are, and you've already got some tension in this narrative. The second paragraph, you get the context, sort of where in the timeline the story starts, and also the very specific threat that the heroes are going to face in this movie. And remember from paragraph 1, we're explicitly told that the Empire is evil, and so that might sort of feel like telling instead of showing, which is supposed to be bad, right? But in paragraph 2, it backs up that assertion with the fact that the Empire is willing to, blow up a whole planet with their giant laser beam. And then finally, in the 3rd paragraph, you get the very specific moment in time that we're jumping into, and also the first character that you should latch onto from the get-go. In a book, of course, it wouldn't make sense to have this kind of explicit summary right at the start. Rather, you'd want to sprinkle these 3 paragraphs or the points in these 3 paragraphs throughout the opening pages. But regardless, this opening summary is why it works so well to start in media res, and specifically in the middle of a battle scene, because you know who the characters are, who you should be rooting for, what the tension and the conflict is, and so you don't feel lost when you go into this battle scene, which is a problem that I think I and a lot of other writers have when you're jumping right into a battle scene in the first scene of a book. So the second thing that's so important that episode 4 does as far as establishing this huge world is that from the outside establishes not only the conflict, but also the aesthetic that you're going to get throughout the series. From the very opening shot, you see this huge Star Destroyer, and it's chasing after Princess Leia's ship, the Tantive 4. And that scene immediately tells people what they can expect and what sort of Star Wars is all about. I think that's really critical when you're doing world building, immersive world building, regardless of whether it's a real world or an imaginary one. And it's important to note that it's not only setting up sort of the surface level aesthetic, but also the main conflict between this sort of all-powerful empire and the scrappy rebellion that's facing them. And then inside of Leia's ship, you start to get a sense of the technology, the droids and the blasters, the power of the Empire and of Darth Vader specifically, and why they are so feared and how power manifests itself in this world, which is another really critical thing to set up. And then the third thing that they do is that they sort of indicate what the scope of this world, this universe is. So right after the scene in Princess Leia's ship, you go down to Tatooine and get a sense of what else is out there in the universe. And it's such a huge contrast to what we've seen so far in the movie that you immediately know, oh, here's the range of what we can expect. Because honestly, they didn't have the budget in this movie to show explicitly the full range of the Star Wars galaxy, but because they show these sort of 2 polar ends of the spectrum, audiences are already understanding what the range of settings and the world is going to be. And then finally, the fourth thing that I think is done really well in A New Hope is that the filmmakers leverage the power of the audience's imagination. So basically, you go into Mos Eisley, you see such a huge variety of species, of droids, of speeders, and then of course of Imperial forces. And all of that gives you the sense that each of these things, each of these characters has a backstory and a homeworld of its own. And the cool thing is that audiences can sort of start to imagine what that might look like because they've already gotten a sense of the Empire's power and also the planets and worlds that these other creatures might call home. So those four things I think are really, really critical when, as a writer, when you're establishing a sprawling world. Quickly establishing the backstory and foundational information, immediately showing us the conflicts and the aesthetic, indicating the scope of the world, and then finally leveraging the audience imagination because there's really no way that you can explicitly show every corner of your world. So then we move on to episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, and this I think is such a great lesson in maintaining tension in the middle of a series, the middle of a trilogy, because this is the middle child. The heroes have won the day in the last episode, and so how do we sort of ramp up the tension again to make for a satisfying conclusion in the third installment without going too overboard so that the next installment feels anticlimactic? I think one really important element of this is the way that they develop the personal journey and the interpersonal relationships of the characters. So for Luke, this is sort of starting to come into his powers as a Jedi, seeking out Yoda, facing down the Force Cave, and having to make those decisions about which path he's going to take and where his loyalties are going to lie. And then of course we have a lot of interpersonal relationships, not only between Luke and Yoda, but also Han and Leia's romance. We get some backstory on Han and Lando and see sort of where their friendship has gone. And of course that famous part where Luke finds out that Darth Vader is his dad, and that sets him up for a whole lot of angst and internal and external conflict. And then, of course, the happy ending of the whole trilogy as well. So you've got these developing threads throughout the movie, but it's not just a movie that's focused on the personal elements. It's also got this really gripping opening, which is one of the things that I think was so striking to me and a lot of people. This battle on Hoth, and I think this takes advantage of a lot of the knowledge that audiences have already developed about this world. Things like the goals of the Rebel Alliance, the sort of huge military industrial power of the Empire, Luke's ability to use the Force. But within this familiar framework, it's also introducing a lot of really cool new elements, like new technology like the AT-ATs, and new ways of fighting and of surviving. And then both of these things, sort of the action and the personal journeys, are tied together in the ending. You've got your sort of blaster fights, your lightsaber battle, but then also that moment where Luke finds out that his dad is the second most evil dude in the galaxy. And then running parallel to that, Han and Lando. Han is betrayed by his old friend, he gets locked in carbonite, and that moment is particularly distressing because of his growing relationship with Leia. And then finally, the ending leaves open a lot of questions. Things like, now that Luke knows that Vader is his dad, what is he gonna do? Vader has basically defeated Luke. He's chopped off his hand. How is Luke going to bounce back from that and then also come up with a new way to lead the Rebel Alliance and to defeat the Empire? How are Luke and Leia and the others going to rescue Han from the carbonite? All of these questions are set up throughout the course of the movie and then left open at the end so that they can be brought together in the last movie. So as a writer, I think the key takeaways here for a successful middle installment of a trilogy or of a series are to focus in on the characters and relationship development, give us some action, but save the big explosions for the final installment. I think the middle book or movie is really for making sure that readers or audiences are really, really invested emotionally in the characters and their relationships, so that when you get to the last installment, the explosions, the large-scale events, those are going to have as much emotional impact as they influence the lives of the characters as possible. So finally, episode 6, Return of the Jedi, I think this is bringing everything together in the finale. What episode 5 did so well was setting up the stakes on both a personal and a galactic level, but not setting it too high in terms of climactic events or action scenes, so that episode 6 still has somewhere to go. I think episode 9 had a problem with this, but that's a discussion for a later video. But anyway, basically the Return of the Jedi answers all of the questions that were brought up in episode 5, both on a personal and a large scale level. So we see what happens with Leia and Han, we see how the rebels finally defeat the Empire, we see the end of Luke's journey of grappling within himself with who his father is and coming into his powers as a Jedi. And I think this sort of answering of questions that were brought up before is how we as audiences feel like we're moving forward in the story, but still getting a sense of continuity, not like these things are sort of coming out of nowhere to just make a really dramatic final installment. And I think really importantly, even though we're getting all of this growth and forward movement, this doesn't feel like a fully different tone or a fully different story, and that's because episode 6 still draws on a lot of the elements that we loved about the previous installments, and so it feels like more of an extension and an expansion of what we've seen before. Some examples of this: so even though Luke is becoming a Jedi, moving on to a different phase of his life, we still see him as part of this rebel alliance, and we still get a sense of what this organization is doing and what the sort of conclusion for them is. Another thing, we return to Tatooine, which of course is hugely important as a location, as a center point throughout a lot of the Star Wars films and media. We return there, it's familiar, but it's also fresh because we're seeing a new side of it, this criminal underworld with Jabba the Hutt that we haven't seen before as much. And then finally, one of the things that I think I and a lot of people love so much is the exploring of the galaxy, seeing different alien species and cultures, and we get some more of that with A New Society, pretty deep dive into the Ewoks. So I think in this final installment of this trilogy, I learned a lot about how to keep things moving forward in terms of plot and character, but not feel like you're leaving things behind from the previous installments. I think a lot of it comes down to planning on the series level instead of the individual book or individual movie level. So sort of set up these familiar locations and people and groups that audiences care about, and do that from the very beginning of the series, but also be opening up different themes and questions that can be answered by the end of the series. And as in the case of Star Wars, it can feel super satisfying if the questions are both on the level of sort of small-scale personal level, but also large-scale galaxy level, because it feels like there's continuity along both of those levels. So, speaking of installments, that's it for the first installment of my series, What I Learned About Writing from Star Wars. The next video will cover the prequel trilogy, so episodes 1 through 3, and then the last video will look at the sequels along with Rogue One. For me, this series was such a huge part of my development, my childhood, my formative years as a writer and a storyteller, and so it's super interesting for me to think about what impacts it might have actually had on me. And I'd love to hear your reflections as well. Whether you were introduced to Star Wars later or whether it's something that you grew up with as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Things that you learned from a storytelling perspective or just thoughts about Star Wars in general, because I could go on and on. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for the prequels.